The woman stumbled through the snow-covered main street of Ordway, Colorado, her torn calico dress doing nothing to shield her from the brutal winter wind that cut through the fabric like knives. And Yates Murdoch knew immediately that something terrible had happened to her. He had been leading his horse toward the livery stable after a long day checking fence lines on his cattle ranch when he saw her collapse against a hitching post, her lips already turning blue, her shoulders shaking violently. The sun had set an hour ago, and the temperature in this February of 1884 had dropped so low that even his heavy coat and wool-lined gloves barely kept the cold at bay. The woman wore nothing but that thin dress, ripped at the shoulder and hem, her feet wrapped in what looked like strips of cloth that were soaked through with melting snow. Yates dropped his horse's reins and ran to her, his boots crunching through the ice that had formed over the packed snow. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and now hung in wet tangles around her face. Her green eyes were unfocused, her breathing shallow and rapid. She was dying right here in front of him, and he did not have time to ask questions. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked, already shrugging out of his heavy sheepskin coat. She did not respond, just continued to shake, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. He draped the coat around her shoulders and fastened the top button at her throat. It swallowed her small frame, hanging nearly to her ankles, but that was exactly what she needed. "Come on," he said gently, putting his arm around her waist to support her weight. "I am taking you somewhere warm." She made a small sound, something between a whimper and a protest, but she did not pull away. Her legs barely seemed to work, and Yates ended up half carrying her down the street. His ranch was 3 miles outside of town, too far for her in this condition. The hotel was closer, but old Mrs. Patterson, who ran the place, had already locked up for the night and was notorious for her unfriendly attitude toward strangers. Doc Harrison lived above his practice on the next street over, and his windows still glowed with lamplight. Yates guided the woman through the drifts of snow, feeling her weight become heavier as she lost what little strength she had left. He knocked hard on Doc Harrison's door with his free hand, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the quiet winter night. Footsteps sounded from inside, and then the door swung open to reveal the doctor, a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that took in the situation immediately. "Bring her in," Doc Harrison said without preamble, stepping aside. "Upstairs to the spare room. My wife will get the fire going." The doctor's wife, Martha, appeared at the top of the stairs and quickly ushered them into a small bedroom where a potbelly stove sat in the corner. She began feeding kindling into it while Yates lowered the woman onto the narrow bed. Doc Harrison was already pulling blankets from a chest, his movements efficient and practiced. "What happened to her?" the doctor asked, layering the blankets over the woman's trembling form. "I found her on Main Street about 10 minutes ago," Yates said. "She was barely standing. That dress is torn to pieces." Doc Harrison's expression darkened as he examined the fabric more closely. This was not an accident. Someone did this to her. He looked at Yates. "Did you see anyone else out there?" "No, the street was empty." Yates moved back to give the doctor room to work, but he could not take his eyes off the woman. Even in her current state, even with her face pale and drawn with cold and exhaustion, there was something about her that struck him deep in his chest. Maybe it was the vulnerability, or maybe it was the set of her jaw that suggested she was fighting with everything she had not to give in to the cold and fear. Martha brought hot water bottles and tucked them around the woman's feet and hands. "Her extremities are frozen solid," she said quietly. "We will be lucky if she does not lose any fingers or toes." The woman's eyes fluttered open, and she looked around the room in confusion before her gaze landed on Yates. For a moment, they just stared at each other, and he saw recognition dawn in her expression. Not recognition of him specifically, but recognition that he was the one who had helped her, who had given her his coat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so faint he almost missed it. "Save your strength," Doc Harrison said, placing a hand on her forehead. "You are severely hypothermic. We need to warm you slowly. Martha, bring that broth from dinner." Over the next 2 hours, Yates watched as the doctor and his wife worked to save the woman's life. They fed her warm broth in careful spoonfuls, replaced the cooling hot water bottles with fresh ones, and monitored her breathing and pulse. Gradually, color began to return to her face, and the violent shaking subsided to occasional tremors. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring words that made no sense, other times lying perfectly still. Yates knew he should leave, should go home to his ranch where his foreman would be wondering what had happened to him, but he found himself unable to walk out that door. He stood against the wall out of the way and waited. Finally, around midnight, Doc Harrison straightened up and nodded with satisfaction. "She will live. Another hour out in that cold and we would be having a very different conversation." He looked at Yates. "You saved her life." "Anyone would have done the same," Yates said, "but you are the one who did it." The doctor pulled him out into the hallway and closed the door partway. "Martha will stay with her tonight. You should go home and get some rest. Come back tomorrow, and maybe she will be well enough to tell us what happened." Yates nodded, though the thought of leaving made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar anxiety. He retrieved his coat, which Martha had hung by the stove to dry, and headed back out into the frozen night. His horse was still waiting patiently where he had left it, and together they made the cold journey back to the ranch. Sleep did not come easily that night. Yates lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about green eyes and torn fabric, and the way the woman had looked at him with such profound gratitude. He had been alone for a long time, ever since he had bought this ranch 5 years ago with money saved from a decade of cattle drives and ranch work. At 28, he was considered a confirmed bachelor by most of the town, too focused on building his herd and improving his land to bother with courting. But something had shifted tonight. Some door in his heart that he had thought permanently closed had cracked open just a fraction. He rode back into town as soon as the sun rose, telling himself it was just to check on the woman's condition, nothing more. Doc Harrison was eating breakfast when Yates arrived, and he waved him in with a knowing look that made Yates feel transparent as glass. "She is awake," the doctor said, "and she has told us quite a story. Her name is Grace Whitmore, and she was traveling with her aunt and uncle from Kansas City to California. They stopped in Ordway 2 days ago because her uncle thought he could win some money at cards. He lost everything instead, including their wagon and horses. Last night, he tried to sell Grace to a man named Dutch Peterson to cover his gambling debts." Yates felt rage ignite in his gut. "He did what?" "Exactly what you are thinking. Grace refused, and when Dutch tried to take her anyway, she fought him off and ran. He tore her dress trying to restrain her, and she has been hiding behind buildings and in alleys since last night, too afraid to ask for help because she did not know who might be working with Dutch or her uncle." "Where is the uncle now?" Yates asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Left town on the morning stage, according to the hotel clerk. Abandoned his wife and niece without a backwards glance." Doc Harrison shook his head in disgust. "The aunt is still here, staying at the hotel, but she claims she has no money and no way to help Grace. And Dutch Peterson has not been seen since last night, probably sleeping off his whiskey at one of the saloons." Yates stood abruptly. "Can I see her? Doc Harrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Martha just brought her some breakfast. Go on up." Grace was sitting up in bed when Yates entered, a bowl of oatmeal balanced on her lap. She looked far better than she had the night before, though her hands were wrapped in bandages, and her face still bore the pallor of someone who had come too close to death. She looked up when he came in, and a small smile crossed her face. "You are the man from last night," she said. "I wanted to thank you properly. Doc Harrison said you carried me here and that your coat saved my life." Yates felt heat rise in his face, unaccustomed to being the focus of such earnest appreciation. "I am glad I was there. My name is Yates Murdoch. I have a ranch just outside of town." "Grace Whitmore," she said, though he already knew that. "I suppose the doctor told you what happened." He did. Yates moved closer, pulling a chair over to sit beside the bed. "I am sorry for what your uncle did to you. That is not how family should treat each other." Grace's expression hardened. "He is not my family anymore. He stopped being my family the moment he put me up as collateral in a card game." She set the oatmeal bowl aside, her appetite apparently gone. "I do not know what I am going to do now. I have no money, no way to get to California, nowhere to go." "What is in California?" Yates asked, a friend from school. "She married a rancher out there and said I could come work as a teacher in their town. It was supposed to be a fresh start after my parents died last year." Grace's voice cracked slightly, and she cleared her throat, visibly fighting for composure. "But I suppose that plan is finished now." Yates found himself speaking before he had fully thought through what he was saying. "You could stay here. In Ordway, I mean. We need a teacher. The last one left to get married 6 months ago, and the children have been without proper schooling since then." Grace looked at him with surprise. "Do you think they would hire me? I have credentials from a teaching college in Kansas City." "I am on the school board," Yates said. "Along with Doc Harrison and Pastor Reynolds. We have been trying to find someone for months. If you want the position, it is yours." For the first time since he had met her, Grace's face lit up with genuine hope. "I would want nothing more. Thank you, Mr. Murdoch. You have done so much for me already." "Yates," he corrected gently. "Just Yates. Then you must call me Grace." Over the next week, as Grace recovered her strength under the watchful care of Doc Harrison and Martha, Yates found himself inventing reasons to visit town every day. He brought her books from his small collection at home, told her about the ranch, and the cattle, and the vast stretches of prairie that surrounded Ordway. Grace, in turn, told him about her childhood in Kansas City, her parents who had run a general store, and her love of teaching that had led her to pursue education, even when her aunt and uncle had thought it a waste of time for a woman. The more time Yates spent with her, the more certain he became that what he felt was not just sympathy or protectiveness, though those emotions were certainly present. There was something about the way Grace smiled at his terrible jokes, the way she listened with genuine interest when he talked about cattle breeding and water rights, the way her eyes sparkled when she discussed Shakespeare and arithmetic, and all the things she wanted to teach the children of Ordway. She was smart and brave and beautiful, and he was falling in love with her so quickly it terrified him. On the 8th day after he had found her in the snow, Doc Harrison declared Grace well enough to leave his care. The school board had officially hired her, and the position came with a small house near the schoolhouse where she could live. Yates helped her move in, carrying the few possessions that had been salvaged from her aunt's hotel room, plus some furniture donated by various townspeople who had heard her story and wanted to help. Grace's aunt had left on the stage 3 days earlier, claiming she was going to live with a cousin in Denver. She had not said goodbye to Grace, and Grace had not seemed to care. "I am better off without them," she had told Yates firmly. "They never wanted me around anyway." I was just free labor and someone to blame when things went wrong. The little house was drafty and needed repairs, but Grace walked through it with wonder, touching the walls and the cast iron stove as if they were made of gold. "It is mine," she kept saying. "Actually mine. I have never had anything that was truly mine before." Yates spent the afternoon fixing the loose boards on the porch and checking the chimney to make sure it would draw properly. Grace made coffee on the stove, and they sat together at the small kitchen table as the sun set, casting orange and pink light through the window. "I do not know how I will ever repay you," Grace said quietly, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. The bandages had come off her fingers 2 days ago, and while they were still slightly red and tender, she had escaped frostbite. "You do not owe me anything," Yates said. "I am just glad you are safe." Grace met his eyes across the table and something passed between them, something electric and unspoken. "I think you know that is not true," she said softly. "I owe you everything. My life, my future, all of it." Yates reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Then let me be part of that future, if you want me to be." Grace's breath caught, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then she turned her hand over in his, lacing their fingers together. "I would like that very much." They took things slowly after that, mindful of how quickly circumstances had thrown them together and wanting to build something real and lasting. Yates courted Grace properly, bringing her flowers from the prairie in the spring, taking her on buggy rides through the countryside, sitting in the front pew of the church every Sunday where she played the organ before services. Grace threw herself into teaching, and the children of Ordway adored her. She was patient and kind but firm when she needed to be, and within months, the schoolhouse rang with recitations and songs. The town watched the romance develop with approval. Everyone knew the story of how Yates had saved Grace from freezing to death, and most people agreed they made a fine couple. There were a few whispers, mostly from bitter old women who thought Grace should have been more properly chaperoned. But those voices were quickly silenced by the majority who recognized true love when they saw it. Summer came, hot and dry, and Yates taught Grace to ride horses so she could visit the ranch more easily. She proved to be a natural horsewoman, fearless and graceful in the saddle, and they spent long evenings riding through the pasture ellens while Yates pointed out different breeds of cattle and explained the intricacies of ranch management. Grace listened and asked intelligent questions, and Yates found himself imagining her not just as a visitor to the ranch, but as its mistress, as his wife. He proposed in August, on a hilltop overlooking his land where they had ridden to watch the sunset. He had been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for a week, waiting for the right moment, and when Grace turned to him with the golden light painting her face and said, "I cannot imagine being anywhere else but here with you," he knew the moment had arrived. "Then do not imagine it," he said, pulling out the ring. "Marry me, Grace. Be my wife, my partner, the person I build my life with." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling as she said, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in September, in the small white church in Ordway with half the town in attendance. Grace wore a dress that Martha Harrison had helped her sew, pale blue with lace at the collar and cuffs, and she carried wildflowers that Yates had picked that morning. Pastor Reynolds performed the ceremony, and when Yates kissed his bride, the church erupted in applause and cheers. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food provided by every family in the area. There was dancing and music, and Yates held Grace close as they swayed to a fiddle tune, aware that his life had changed completely in the 7 months since he had found her dying in the snow. "Are you happy?" he murmured into her ear. "Happier than I ever knew I could be," Grace replied, pulling back to look at him. "You gave me more than your coat that night, Yates. You gave me hope. You gave me a reason to keep fighting." "You gave me something too," Yates said. "You gave me a future worth living for." They settled into married life easily, as if they had been together for years instead of months. Grace continued teaching during the school year, and Yates ran the ranch with the help of his foreman and a few hired hands. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the stars come out and talking about everything and nothing. Grace proved to be an asset to the ranch in ways Yates had not expected. She had a good head for numbers and helped him reorganize his accounting system, catching several errors that had been costing him money. She also had a way with people that made negotiations with buyers and suppliers go more smoothly. Several times, Yates watched in admiration as Grace charmed a tough cattle buyer into offering a better price or convinced a difficult neighbor to agree to a fence line adjustment. "You are wasted as just a teacher," Yates told her one night. "You could run an empire if you wanted to." Grace laughed. "I do not want an empire. I just want this, what we have right here." Their first winter together was harsh, with temperatures dropping below zero and snow piling up in drifts taller than a man. But inside the ranch house, with fires burning in every hearth and Grace's presence filling the rooms with warmth, Yates had never felt more content. They spent long evenings reading aloud to each other, playing cards and making plans for the spring. It was during one of those winter nights that Grace told him she was pregnant. They were lying in bed, the quilts piled high, and she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There is a baby in here," she said quietly. "Our baby." Yates felt his throat close with emotion. "Are you sure? I saw Doc Harrison yesterday. He confirmed it. The baby should come in late June or early July." Yates pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I love you so much," he said, his voice muffled. "I cannot believe this is real sometimes." "It is real," Grace assured him. "All of it. We are real." Their son was born on a hot July afternoon in 1885, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours and left Grace exhausted but triumphant. Yates held the baby, a red-faced, squalling thing that weighed barely 7 pounds, and felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" Grace asked from the bed, her hair damp with sweat but her eyes shining. "I was thinking about my father," Yates said. "His name was Thomas." "Thomas Murdoch," Grace repeated, testing the sound of it. "I like it. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world, little one." Thomas proved to be a healthy, happy baby who rarely cried and seemed fascinated by everything around him. Grace took the fall semester off from teaching to care for him, and Yates found excuses to come in from the range multiple times a day just to hold his son and marvel at the tiny fingers and toes. As Thomas grew, the ranch prospered. Yates made smart investments, bought more land, and expanded his herd. Grace returned to teaching part-time, with Martha Harrison helping to watch Thomas during school hours. The little boy thrived under the attention of so many people who loved him, and by the time he was 2 years old, he was already trying to follow his father around the ranch on his chubby toddler legs. In 1887, Grace gave birth to their daughter, Eleanor, named after Grace's mother. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes, and she was born screaming with indignation at being thrust into the world. "She is going to be a handful," Doc Harrison predicted, and he was right. Eleanor was fierce and independent from the start, refusing to be coddled and demanding to do everything herself. Yates loved watching Grace with their children, seeing the patience and gentleness she brought to motherhood. She sang to them, read to them, taught them their letters and numbers before they were old enough for school. She also taught them kindness and compassion, lessons Yates thought were just as important as anything they would learn from books. The years passed quickly, marked by birthdays and holidays and the steady rhythm of ranch life. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved horses and wanted to be a rancher like his father. Eleanor was wild and adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring the prairie, coming home with scraped knees and stories of imaginary adventures. In 1890, Grace gave birth to their third child, another son they named William, and the ranch house was filled with the noise and chaos and joy of a growing family. Through it all, Yates never forgot the night he had found Grace in the snow. Every winter, when the first big storm hit, he would stand at the window and remember how close he had come to losing her before he had even known her. Grace told him once that she thought about it too, about how a few minutes later or a slightly different path home and they never would have met, never would have had this life together. "I do not believe in fate," Yates said, "but I believe we were meant to find each other. However it happened, I am grateful for every day." As the children grew older, they learned the story of how their parents had met, and it became a favorite tale they asked to hear over and over. Yates would describe the snowy night, the torn dress, the way their mother had looked at him with those green eyes. Grace would add her perspective, talking about how terrified she had been, how certain she was going to die, and how a stranger had appeared like a guardian angel and saved her life. "But he was not a stranger for long," Grace always finished. "He became my best friend, my husband, my everything." In 1895, when Thomas was 10, Eleanor 8, and William 5, the family took a trip to Denver for the stock show. It was the first time any of the children had been to a big city, and their excitement was infectious. They stayed in a hotel, ate at restaurants, and walked through the exhibition halls looking at prize cattle and new farming equipment. On the last night of the trip, Yates and Grace slipped away from the hotel, leaving the children under the supervision of Martha Harrison, who had come along to help. They walked through the city streets hand in hand, looking in shop windows and enjoying the rare time alone together. "Do you ever regret it?" Yates asked as they stood on a bridge overlooking the South Platte River. "Staying in Ordway instead of going to California like you planned?" Grace turned to him with surprise. "Never, not for a single moment. California was just a dream, something I thought I wanted because I did not know what else to do with my life. But what we have built together, that is real. That is everything I actually needed." "I worry sometimes that ranch life is too hard for you," Yates admitted. "That you deserved someone who could give you an easier life." Grace reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Yates Murdoch, you listened to me. You gave me the life I was meant to have. You gave me love and safety and a home and a family. Nothing could be better than that. Nothing." Yates kissed her there on the bridge, with the city lights reflecting off the water below and the sounds of Denver all around them, and he felt the same spark he had felt that first night in Doc Harrison's house, when Grace had looked at him with gratitude and something more. They returned to Ordway and settled back into their routines, but with a renewed appreciation for what they had built. The ranch continued to grow, and Yates began teaching Thomas the business of cattle ranching, taking him along on buying trips and showing him how to evaluate stock. Eleanor announced she wanted to be a teacher like her mother, and Grace began giving her more advanced lessons to prepare her. William, the baby, declared he was going to be a cowboy who rode in rodeos, and Yates built him a small practice arena where he could learn to rope hay bales. In 1898, Grace stopped teaching at the school permanently, deciding to focus on the ranch and her own children. A new teacher, fresh from a college in St. Louis, took over the schoolhouse, and Grace threw herself into ranch management. She had always been involved, but now she took on more responsibility, managing the household accounts, overseeing the kitchen garden that had expanded into a small farm producing vegetables and chickens and pigs. That summer, Dutch Peterson returned to Ordway. Yates was in town buying supplies when he saw the man, older and rougher looking than he had been 14 years earlier, walking into the saloon. Rage flooded through Yates, white-hot and blinding, and he started to follow, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his hip. A hand caught his arm. It was Doc Harrison, older now but still sharp-eyed. "Do not do it," the doctor said quietly. "He is not worth it, and Grace would never forgive you for getting yourself killed or arrested over that piece of trash." "He tried to buy her," Yates said through gritted teeth. "He tore her dress and chased her into the snow to die." "I know. But that was a long time ago, and Grace is safe now. She has you and your children and a good life. Do not throw that away for revenge." Yates took a deep breath, then another, forcing himself to calm down. "You are right. But if he comes near my family, I will not be responsible for what happens." "Fair enough," Doc Harrison said. "But he is leaving on tomorrow's stage, heading west. The bartender told me. He is just passing through." True to the doctor's word, Dutch Peterson was gone the next day, and Yates never mentioned to Grace that he had been in town. There was no point in stirring up old fears and bad memories. The past was the past, and their present was too good to taint it. The new century arrived with celebration and hope. On January 1st, 1900, the whole family gathered at the ranch house along with friends and neighbors to mark the occasion. Pastor Reynolds said a prayer thanking God for bringing them all safely into a new era, and everyone raised glasses of cider and whiskey to toast the future. Yates stood with his arm around Grace, watching their children laugh and play with the other young people, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. He was 44 years old now, his hair starting to gray at the temples, his hands permanently scarred from decades of ranch work. Grace was 38, laugh lines at the corners of her eyes and a few silver strands in her auburn hair. But when he looked at her, he still saw the woman he had wrapped his coat around on that freezing night, still felt the same pull in his chest that told him she was his home. As if sensing his thoughts, Grace turned and smiled at him. "What are you thinking about? How lucky I am," Yates said simply. "How different my life would be if I had ridden home a different way that night." "Our lives," Grace corrected. "Both of our lives would be different. I would probably be dead, frozen in an alley somewhere, forgotten by everyone." "Never forgotten," Yates said fiercely. "Even if I had not found you, someone would have remembered you, someone would have mourned you." "Maybe," Grace said, "but I am glad we do not have to find out. I am glad I get to have this instead, all of this." The children grew and changed. Thomas became a serious young man, taking on more responsibility at the ranch and proving he had his father's gift for handling cattle and his mother's head for business. At 18, he started courting a girl from a neighboring ranch, Sarah Bennett, and Yates and Grace both approved of the match. Eleanor finished her education and announced she wanted to attend a teaching college in Colorado Springs, a decision that filled Grace with pride even as it made her sad to think of her daughter leaving home. William, at 13, was all gangly limbs and big dreams, still determined to be a rodeo cowboy despite his mother's concerns about the danger. In 1903, Thomas and Sarah were married in the same church where Yates and Grace had said their vows 18 years earlier. The young couple moved into a house on the ranch property, and Thomas took over more of the day-to-day operations, allowing Yates to slow down a bit. At 47, he was starting to feel his age, the long days in the saddle taking a toll on his back and knees. Grace was there to soothe his aches, rubbing liniment into sore muscles and insisting he take breaks more often. "You are not 20 anymore," she would scold gently. "Let Thomas and the hands do the heavy work." "I am not an old man yet," Yates would protest, but he secretly appreciated the care and the excuse to spend more time with his wife. Eleanor left for college that fall, tearful but determined, and the house felt emptier without her bright presence. Grace threw herself into correspondence, writing Eleanor long letters every week and eagerly reading the replies that came back full of stories about classes and new friends and the excitement of city life. William, left as the only child still at home, became even more adventurous, pushing boundaries and testing limits in the way of teenage boys everywhere. Yates remembered his own youth and tried to be patient, giving William enough freedom to make his own mistakes while still providing guidance when needed. In 1905, Thomas and Sarah had their first child, a daughter they named Rose. Becoming grandparents brought a new dimension to Yates and Grace's life. Grace doted on the baby, making tiny dresses and knitting blankets, while Yates carved wooden toys and built a cradle that he swore would last for generations. They watched Thomas and Sarah navigate the challenges of new parenthood with amusement and sympathy, remembering their own struggles all those years ago. Eleanor returned home after 2 years of college, her teaching certificate in hand, and took a position at a school in a town 20 miles north of Ordway. She rented a room with a family there, but came home most weekends, filling the house with energy and stories. She brought with her a young man named David Fletcher, a lawyer's clerk who clearly adored her, and Yates found himself having serious conversations about intentions and futures. William, at 16, was already entering rodeo competitions, winning some and losing more but refusing to give up on his dream. Grace worried constantly, but Yates told her to let the boy find his own way. "He has your stubbornness," he said with a grin. "He will be fine." The years continued to pass, each one bringing changes and challenges, but also joy and growth. Eleanor married David Fletcher in 1907, and they settled in his hometown, where he had been promoted to junior partner in a law firm. William finally won a major rodeo competition in 1908, vindicated in his persistence, and used his winnings to buy his own small ranch where he planned to raise rodeo stock. Thomas and Sarah had 2 more children, giving Yates and Grace 3 grandchildren to spoil. Through it all, the love between Yates and Grace only deepened. They had weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical, supported each other through losses, and celebrated victories together. They knew each other's rhythms and moods, could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, finished each other's sentences without thought. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1910, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. The children and grandchildren were there, along with old friends like Doc Harrison and Martha, now both in their 80s but still spry and sharp. Pastor Reynolds, retired but still beloved, said a blessing over the meal. The tables groaned with food, and after dinner, Yates stood up to make a speech. "25 years ago," he began, his voice strong despite the emotion he felt, "I found a woman freezing to death in the snow. I gave her my coat and brought her to safety, thinking I was just doing what any decent person would do. I had no idea that woman would become the center of my entire world." He looked down at Grace, seated beside him, and saw tears streaming down her face. "Grace, you have given me everything. You have made me a better man, a better father, a better human being. You have filled my life with purpose and love and meaning. Every single day with you has been a gift, and I would go through 100 snowstorms to find you again if I had to." Grace stood and wrapped her arms around him, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. Eleanor was crying openly, and even Thomas, normally so stoic, had to wipe his eyes. The grandchildren, too young to fully understand but caught up in the emotion, clapped and laughed. Later that night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Yates and Grace sat on the porch in their rocking chairs, watching the stars wheel overhead. The night was warm and clear, so different from that brutal winter evening 26 years ago. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Grace asked quietly. "When you picked me up off that hitching post, I said I was taking you somewhere warm," Yates recalled. "You did more than that," Grace said. "You took me home, I just did not know it yet." Yates reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining automatically after so many years of the gesture. "You made it a home. Before you, it was just a house on a ranch. You made it something worth coming back to every day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. Then Grace said, "I want you to know that if I could go back to that night, knowing everything that would happen, all the hard times and the struggles, I would still choose this. I would still choose you. Even knowing your uncle would betray you, that you would almost die." "Even then," Grace said firmly, "because all of that led me to you, and you are worth everything I went through to get here." Yates pulled her close, and they sat wrapped in each other's arms until the moon rose high above them. Inside the house, their grandson William was sleeping, visiting for the weekend. In houses nearby, their other children were settling down for the night with their own families. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and well-managed, a legacy they had built together. "I love you," Yates said into Grace's hair, words he had spoken 10,000 times but never tired of saying. "I love you too," Grace replied, words she would speak 10,000 more times if she lived long enough. Forever and always. As 1910 turned into 1911 and beyond, Yates and Grace grew older together with grace and dignity. They handed over more responsibilities to Thomas, content to spend their days in simpler pursuits. Grace tended her garden and wrote letters to their far-flung children and grandchildren. Yates worked with the horses he loved and taught his grandsons everything he knew about ranching and life. In 1915, their 30th anniversary, all three of their children managed to come home for a celebration. Eleanor brought her husband and 3 children. William came with his new wife Clara, and Thomas and Sarah gathered with their 4 children, the youngest just a baby. The house was full to bursting, and Grace declared it the happiest chaos she had ever experienced. They took a family photograph that day, everyone dressed in their best clothes, gathered on the porch of the ranch house. Yates and Grace sat in the center, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, and when the photographer told them to hold still, Yates put his arm around Grace's shoulders and smiled more broadly than he had in any previous photograph. That picture would hang in the living room for decades to come, a testament to what 2 people could build when they found each other against all odds. As the years advanced, Yates and Grace became the beloved elders of not just their family but the entire community. People sought their advice on everything from ranching techniques to relationship problems. They were known for their fairness, their kindness, and the obvious devotion they had for each other. Doc Harrison passed away in 1917, and Yates and Grace both wept at his funeral, remembering how he had saved Grace's life and given them both the chance at happiness. Martha followed him just 6 months later, and Grace said it was because she could not bear to be without him, a sentiment she understood completely. In the early 1920s, as Yates entered his 7th decade and Grace her 6th, they made the decision to sell the bulk of the ranch to Thomas, keeping just the house and a small parcel of land for themselves. It was time, they agreed, to fully retire and enjoy whatever years they had left without the burden of managing a large operation. They spent their final years in peace and contentment, surrounded by a growing number of grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. They told their story countless times to the younger generations, wanting them to understand that love could be found in the most unexpected places, and that choosing to be kind, to help someone in need, could change the entire course of a life. Yates passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1928 at the age of 72, with Grace holding his hand. His last words to her were, "Thank you for saying yes that day on the hill. Thank you for choosing me." Grace lived for 3 more years, surrounded by family but missing the other half of her heart. She died in the summer of 1931, and her children found her sitting in her rocking chair on the porch, a letter to Yates in her lap that she had been writing, telling him about the garden and the grandchildren and how much she missed him. They were buried side by side in the Ordway Cemetery, under a simple granite headstone that read, "Yates and Grace Murdoch, united in love forever in peace." At the funeral, Thomas told the story one last time about the cowboy who had given a freezing woman his coat and led her to safety, never imagining she would become his whole world. Eleanor spoke about her mother's strength and her father's kindness, and how their love had been the foundation that all of their children had built their own lives upon. William, now a successful rancher and former rodeo champion, talked about the lessons his parents had taught him about perseverance and devotion. The legacy of Yates and Grace Murdoch lived on through their descendants, who carried forward the values they had embodied. The ranch remained in the family for generations, and the story of how it all began, with a torn dress and a winter storm and an act of simple human kindness, became a cherished part of family lore. Years later, when the great-great-grandchildren asked how their ancestors had met, they would be told about that February night in 1884, when a cowboy found a woman dying in the snow and wrapped his coat around her and led her home, and how that single moment of compassion had created a love story that lasted a lifetime and echoed through the ages.